Boom.
All right. Should I go first? Do you want to go first?
Go first.
Excellent. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Cameron. I'm the founder and CEO at Magellan AI. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm a half software engineer, half salesperson, and a full-time data nerd. So today's topic is one that is near and dear to my heart. Little background on us. We are a podcast media planning platform at Magellan AI. Have been tracking advertisers in the space since 2017. And then you can kind of think about us as our goal is really to provide the most accurate reflection of what's happening in the podcast advertising market. We cover the US and then 3 other markets as well. Part of this, you kind of all started as, as a part of this, we rolled out the Podscape as an overview of the podcast advertising landscape late last year. We'll be talking about the Podscape later on. The goal is really just to kind of provide a home for every single company in the podcast space, since it has gotten a lot more crowded in the market, a lot more companies doing really cool stuff, coming to market. And so we'll be talking through that, through the course of this presentation in the context of data specifically.
Awesome. And I'm Krystina Rubino. I lead the offline marketing practice at Right Side Up. I've actually been in media for 15 years. I started out as a digital native and then eventually was buying print and did comms planning. About 5 years ago, I found my way into podcasting and got hooked really quickly because unlike the millions of dollars in digital display that I was buying at the time, we could prove that people did something after they were exposed to an ad, which is really exciting. And then I actually came to Right Side Up about 2.5 years ago, started the offline practice. We have a healthy podcast practice that sits within that. And we've helped over 50 advertisers of all stages navigate the channel. And yeah, that's pretty much it. We'll go into it a little bit later, but we are just really committed to helping advertisers uncomplicate the channel. Just because I think that we are all kind of casting about for like what the answers are. And there is no answer yet. It's a nascent media type. We just aren't there. So the advertisers who are going to be the most successful are going to be the ones who are taking advantage of this media landscape and of this time before the channel is like fully monetized with technology, et cetera. And that's kind of where we sit and help advertisers out the most. Should we get into it?
Let's do it.
I'm going to advance slides. Yes.
Perfect. Well, to start with, I'll give a little bit of context around, where Magellan AI comes up with its data. And so the software that we've built is just really good at going into, episodes of podcasts and picking up, host-read and pre-recorded ads on those episodes. So, when you hear an ad where a host tells a personal story about how, Casper mattress saved their marriage, we're really good at recognizing those moments in podcasts and tagging that content. And we do that across thousands of the most popular podcasts every week. Take it to the next slide. Perfect. So that's the underlying engine. Where that goes, so we've sampled over 37,000 podcasts and really produced millions of ads that have come out of those podcasts and made those available in our platform. We take all that data, we dump it in the Magellan AI cloud, as you can see from the visual here, and a bunch of things come out of that. So, we help advertisers connect with podcasts, via our Get Introduced functionality. We help advertisers and agencies like build media plans as they look at, where other advertisers have spent in the space and, where there might be white space to look at. We help, publishers and advertisers across the space track spend and, understand how much different advertisers are doing. And then, of course, get involved in, looking at specific creative and, post-campaign analysis as well.
And it's funny because the way that I met Cam was, I think in 2018 or maybe 2017, when I was in-house as an advertiser trying to figure all of this out. I met Cam, got a download of the platform, and it was just very quickly, I was like, oh my God, this is going to be amazing. And in full disclosure, I've since become an advisor to the company. So in addition to my role at Right Side Up, I want to disclose that because I think it's really important for leadership in the industry to disclose when they're involved with companies. And in terms of what we actually do at Right Side Up and why Magellan is one of our key tools, we are actually a collective of growth marketing specialists. So podcasting is just one of the paid channels in which we work. We cover virtually all paid channels across SEO, CRO, email marketing, analytics, B2C and B2B. And the way that we work is a little different than a traditional media agency. So we don't work on commission. We charge based on our effort. What that also allows us to do is buy media in-house. And we don't have any long-term contracts, because if you're an advertiser who's testing in the channel for the first time, and I'm somebody telling you, you've got to make a 60 to 90-day commitment, as somebody who used to be in-house, it just didn't work for me. So we like to say that we've founded the company and the resources that we would have wanted ourselves when we're in-house. And the last part is we help companies bring the functions in-house fully if they'd like to, because that's where we think the best work happens. And in terms of what we do, a lot of our core podcast capabilities are things that are familiar to everybody who's coming in here. We do a lot of basically pre-work to help advertisers make sure that even before they spend $1 in the channel, that money is going to be counted and be able to be measured to the same extent that other media channels are measured for them. And just so like for a heads up as to why I feel qualified to speak to you on all of this today, besides my digital background in technology, our podcast practice has invested over $50 million profitably in aggregate since 2019. And for some of the advertisers that we mentioned here. So we've got a lot of active advertisers in the space. We sit on top of a lot of performance media spend. And one of the things that I am the most committed to is making sure that we have a more transparent ecosystem. I think that everybody wins when we share information, share wins, and all that good stuff. So without further ado, why are we here? Kind of a big question. Cam, I think you were going to get into the meaning of life, right?
Absolutely. It's a really critical question we have to ask ourselves every day. Why do I even get out of bed?
That's a good point. But the reason why we're actually here today is because I was punchy yesterday, and when Cam and I were talking through content, I was like, do you remember Aladdin when Robin Williams as the genie is going, phenomenal cosmic powers, itty bitty living space? That is what podcast monetization is like right now. There are 1.75 million podcasts, but very few of them are actually monetized. And I was even shocked, Cam, I know that Magellan indexes a ton of podcasts, but I was just so fascinated as to how it kind of boils down to what we actually buy.
Yeah, so overall, since 2017, we've actually sampled 30,000 different podcasts, or more than 30,000 different podcasts. If you look at over all time and every podcast we sampled, I would say just under half of those have been monetized, or we picked up ads on just under half of those. For this, conversation, we looked at just the 11,000 or so podcasts that we sampled most frequently in 2020. And what we found is that about 75% of those were monetized, meaning that we, again, picked up ads, either in the form of a podcast ad advertising on another podcast, or an advertiser that's actually placing a spot. And it's really pretty amazing because we see the same 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 podcasts coming up over and over again. With the most, advertisers in the space. So as much as there are 1.75 million different podcasts out there, the universe that advertisers seem to be operating in is a much smaller component of that.
And I can actually back that up, because when we were looking at our performance indexing tool, which is an internal tool we've developed at Right Side Up to look and not only aggregate cross-client performance and look at it, but also index it against each other, because what you got to do to sell a mattress is not the same thing that you have to do to sell a toothbrush or financial planning services, et cetera. So everybody's got different CPA goals and customer acquisition costs, et cetera. But we've purchased over 1,700 shows across 170 different networks, partners, direct partners, all that, across the 50 different advertisers. So if you think about 1,700 shows out of 1.75 million podcasts, the reason that we're actually here is because nobody knows what to buy unless you have access to data that tells you what to buy.
Yeah,
or platforms like Magellan.
Yeah, and it's tough. It's like, we actually also looked at, like, the question is, who's not selling ads, right? When you look at this, the broader market, we found, if you were just coming into the market, you might like have to, I don't know, maybe you pull up like a chart, you see what's popular. Like a good example of a podcast that, usually is in the top charts, like Chapo Trap House. It's an indie podcast. They're monetizing on Patreon. Or is it Patreon? They, they are, have a huge subscriber base on Patreon, and that's how they make their money. We also see, podcasts that are from, big brands like exchanges at Goldman Sachs. They're not, selling ads to Morgan Stanley.
They don't need to.
They don't need to. I've heard they make their money other ways. And then, there are also like smaller niche podcasts, like the Financial Independence podcast. It really is like a creator of the podcast, like promoting some other product. We see that also with like authors and books, like putting out podcasts that are kind of telling their story, but the way they make money is you go buy their book. So pretty interesting to see the variety of ways that creators monetize. But when you get down to it, just 6,000 or 7,000 or 8,000 podcasts that are really coming up over and over again. And I think we also looked into kind of ad serving technology as we were thinking about understanding the market, and found that in 2020, just under half of the podcasts we sampled were using dynamic insertion. If you look at the last 90 days, though, that's actually up to closer to 60%. So about 59% of the shows that we're sampling are really using dynamic insertion.
But using dynamic insertion doesn't necessarily mean that they're selling their impressions or selling their downloads on an impression basis, which this is another really fun thing. Dynamic insertion has become like this multifaceted term that we use in our industry to not just talk about like the way we knit ads, regardless of how they're sold, into episodes. We've started using it as parlance for like impression-based media. So we can go through a little bit of like how that's, how it's an interesting, I like to say that a lot of the terms that we use as an industry are like, remember in The Princess Bride, when these like, I don't think you know what that word means, or like that word does not mean what you think it means. We've definitely got a little bit of that going on in podcasting. And again, it's because the monetization of podcasting is nascent. It's, we've been monetizing radio and television for the last like 60, 70 years. We've only been monetizing podcasts for about like 12. So it's pretty daunting. And just to think about like how far we've come in that time. But somehow we've actually managed to create quite the complicated landscape just that short amount of time. And I'm grateful to Magellan and Sounds Profitable for collabing on this, because I used to use the display Lumascape as a way to say, it's just a little complicated. We have to really be diligent about the partners we're using and the mix of technologies we're using, where we're buying our media, and all of that good stuff. So I find it a really helpful, like, objective tool to just help you understand where everybody kind of sits in the space.
Yeah. Should we get into the Podscape a little bit further?
Yeah, let's go through it, because I think actually I should have just stopped. Maybe I'm not sharing my screen. Nope.
You did. I can share here. Can you see the Podscape now?
Yes.
Amazing. All right. So yeah, let's get into it. So should we talk about, maybe start at like, planning tools and metrics?
Yeah, let's go through it.
Sounds good. Yeah. So, I guess first of all, like, we put together the Podscape, to Krystina's point, because we saw so many companies popping up, not just, publishers and, content creators, but, a lot of more ad tech companies. And, it's really hard to, in some cases, like figure out how everyone fits together. So for the Podscape, we took the we took the same flavor as the like Lumascape, where you have advertisers on one side, you have listeners on the other, and as you read across the page, like in theory, the kind of advertisers should be getting closer and closer to the listener, through the technology that's available out there, and through the companies that are representing those advertisers, like the agencies and consulting partners that are out there. So that's how to read the Podscape. I mean, the way we like try to fit into the podcast advertising landscape is really trying to take all the terrible parts of Krystina's job and write software to do those things. So that's kind of how we think about media planning and really supporting media planners as they build different tools. But actually, like Krystina, how does Magellan AI and how do other tools like fit into your process today?
So it's funny because the planning process doesn't look that dissimilar from like if you've ever been in a channel where you're buying relationally. So like think about like print, out of home, like channels where you're still like calling up a human being and talking about media that you want to purchase. When we think about planning, we use Magellan AI actually, and we predicate our scopes with clients on it because one of my colleagues, I love this, he said once, I am smart and lazy enough to want to do things once. And that is literally, I'm like, if I can automate it, like no one human needs to be emailing partners for air checks, and no like sales reps and account managers need to be wasting their time and taking like snippets of sound to send to people so they can pay them for media. Like it's crazy. But even with like technology available, so when we think about like how Magellan fits into our planning process, we still use Magellan for the same kind of planning that we've been doing in this channel for a long time, which is basically cohort-based analysis. So if you think about it and you're like, all right, well, I'm planning for Brooklinen. So if I'm in the middle of planning for Brooklinen, I'm going to take a look and I'm going to look at like, okay, this is like, these are the products who feel like they target Brooklinen's audience. And this is part of the art and science of media planning, right? Like regardless of how complicated this Podscape is, sadly, the process I'm about to give you is basically the best that we as an industry have come up with so far. Like we're still using both cohort-based analysis. So like, okay, Brooklinen, let's look and see where their competitors are, like Boll and Branch, Parachute, et cetera. Let's look and see like I said, cohorts who might be targeting a similar consumer. Look at shows who have been proposed by different partners and see like, what's their monetization history look like? In Magellan, you can pull up renewals. If you see a show that doesn't have a ton of advertisers renewing, you can directionally say, maybe that one's not so great. So it's just all of these like kind of subjective inputs, or the inputs that you're kind of using subjectively. So that's why it requires like a more senior seasoned planner to execute this channel at this point. Like we only staff consultants to business. Every single piece of business that I staff to has at least one consultant on it who's scaled podcast advertising past $500,000 a month for companies. It's just the best way to continue creating campaigns for companies that work is to give you senior resources that know how to use all of these different tools that we're talking about.
So it sounds like there's like art and science, and the science is like there's some data out there, but it still takes someone to interpret that data.
It does. And the challenge also is that like historically, all of this performance data has been locked up with a couple of performance agencies. And that is why historically spend for the channel has come out of a couple of agencies. But if we're going to grow, we need to de-aggregate some of this data and bring it into the light and start to create tools and processes for advertisers that feel replicable in-house, as opposed to just like hoarding data and only using it in the context of some planning exercises. So, and we actually do have a tool that we created. We call it the performance indexing tool, or the PIT. And that is, I mentioned like cross-client information, like looking at prior performance is great. And a lot of agencies and planners in the channel do that. The challenge is that you still have to use it directionally. Otherwise, you're going to wind up buying like a show that hasn't been a thing since 2018. It's an interesting thing, because also we then look at like, when we're thinking of planning and executing in the channel for a different advertiser, what are their competitors spending and what are their competitors buying? And when we think about like, all of that is directional. Mm-hmm. It will be directional forever, just because it's based on rate cards, just like Kantar is and other media channels. But like Magellan has started actually pulling together advertiser spend estimates. And we were just comparing like benchmarks and actuals before this. In aggregate, Magellan is pretty dead on for where Right Side Up invested last year in terms of dollars. It's always going to be squishy on a client basis, but You know,
Yeah,
it's going
it's
to be
like,
directional.
it's definitely like a bit of a a challenge to figure out like where all the bodies are buried. One thing we don't have, we're not looking at IOs, right? Like we're
No.
taking rate card data, we're taking, our estimates for how large shows are. It's really helpful because then it does contextualize, is an advertiser spending, $1 million in space? Or are they spending, 10,000, or are they spending 100,000? I would like to think we're relatively accurate, but like the reality is we're just never going to know when you're getting a 2-for-1 ad deal. That's really between the advertiser and the podcast publisher. And, we're really here just to like provide a little bit of transparency into, how we think the ad market is trading. But the reality is it is only going to be directional for sure.
Yeah, totally. And it's also like, it is just so fascinating that like when we also then think about like charts and rankers, like love them, but if another publisher reaches out to me and is like, we were on the top 10 in Apple this week, I don't care. Like, I'm so sorry. I'm really happy for you. But in the context of where I decide to invest in advertisers' money, it doesn't matter because Apple's algorithmic. Spotify's algorithmic. This is just based on like trends and what's hot and like some other secret sauce. It's like KFC's spices. We're never going to know the exact mix for Apple's algorithm. And it's helpful, it's interesting, but like the same thing for the opt-in trackers or the survey-based stuff. Like when it comes to opt-in trackers, Edison's interesting, but it's not the entire universe of podcast ad. Like it's not, the equivalent is not ComScore. Like if you go in and you want to pull like a digital ranker for what sites hit your demographics and your audience and all that good stuff, there are tools like ComScore. Nielsen has an ad relevance product. There's a ton of different tools that you can use, but because they are still opt-in, we benefit on the digital end from these technologies being available for a long time and having a high degree of opt-in. Whereas in the podcast industry, there are businesses like Podtrac and Edison who only are able to give you a slice of what's available. So all of the charts and rankers are helpful and interesting directionally, but they are not like the end all be all. Like I would never go to an advertiser and be like, you should give this podcast $100,000 because they were number 2 on Apple last week.
Right. Yeah. It's a black box. Like no one quite knows how like Apple is, calculating their rankings. You can kind of guess, you can see it's like, there's some aspect of like how many times an episode's downloaded. I'm sure but there also is like, Apple has the benefit, and Spotify and Stitcher have the benefit of seeing how listeners actually behave like in their podcast player apps. Similarly, like to your point, like the opt-in rankers are just, either you've plugged in the prefix that allows you to, track the download, or you haven't. And, the reality is that not every host, supports every single, download ranker. And so it ends up being, a little bit from here, a little bit from here. You can't just look at a single source of truth, which is, I think one of the strengths of the podcast space, right? But also like, obviously it makes it a lot more challenging if you're, coming in and trying to figure out how to buy for the first time.
Oh, dude, I can't tell you how many times, like, I'll get somebody coming to me and they're like, This American Life is such a great show. I'm like, yes, it absolutely is. Up First is such a great show. NPR has the best content. Absolutely. But I tend to use those placements as more of a vehicle for awareness or mass reach, or less for a performance vehicle. Because like let's just say you want to do some sort of an endorsed thing with NPR, they're a public radio company, same thing with WNYC. So they're going to have different restrictions, and they're to be used for a different media purpose, a different media goal. Whereas when you work with hosts and producers to do like an actual genuine endorsement, those same restrictions about like promotional content don't exist. So it's just also about like knowing the right tools for the job, the right placements for the advertiser. Yeah.
100%. So should we talk about campaign measurement and some of the tools that are out there for that?
Yeah, that's a totally uncomplicated, tactic. There's nothing fine. So I have bought a lot of survey-based methodology. I used to be like the agency side expert for DoubleClick and DFP DFA back in the day. Dart, however you want to call it. It's had a million names in the last 15 years. But I have a lot of digital experience that I bring to the channel. And with that, a lot of incredulity about the attribution tools that are available. It's not that I don't think they're helpful directionally or interesting, or that I don't think the technology has promise. My problem is that we are racing towards adopting technology like pixel-based attribution that is becoming obsolete in other industries. Like, do you even Facebook, bro? Like, IDFA is setting up Apple and Facebook for a hell of a fight. And in podcast advertising, we're sitting here going, pixels are the future. That is just, it doesn't make sense. And I want us to be able to use the current technology available and device graph matching to get at some sort of like something that feels a little better than survey-based methodology. But like, spoiler alert, the other challenge with, besides like actual challenges with pixel tracking that would take another 45 minutes to get into, it also, there's a bleed of content. So like, for example, it's a lot of shows simulcast on YouTube. So like pixels can't measure those views. Even like IAB is standardized downloads, but when you get media downloads from a publisher's rate card, they might be including streaming impressions as part of their inventory, as well they should, because that's how we transact on it. So from a both buying perspective and an attribution perspective, there's just a lot more work that we need to do, because there are blind spots in all of this technology. And it's also directional. So attribution modeling is modeling. It's not fact. It is subject to statistical significance. And so when you don't have acceptance across all of the shows in your media plan, like for example, with some of the pixel-based partners, we can only measure like 20 or 30% of some of our most scaled advertisers. And I know that we actually had a partner ask ahead of time if we require any attribution as like part of our media buys. The answer is no. We recommend advertisers pull in the technology based on the merits of the technology. Same to publishers. If there is something about somebody's technology that is giving you pause to like pull into your ecosystem, that's on you. And media spend from an advertiser shouldn't be telling you how to run your business. That's just something I feel passionately about, because I think we have to just evaluate technology on its own merits and not make some of the same mistakes that we've made in digital. Like we need to give advertisers and publishers control from the outset. Otherwise, we're going to wind up repeating the sins of the past. And I'm really trying hard not to do that, because I hated buying banners eventually. And I love podcast advertising.
What about brand lift studies? Is that then something that you've used, or what are your thoughts on those?
I have spent so much money on brand lift studies in my career. And they are always interesting directionally. But if you're trying to use a brand lift study to optimize a performance-based advertising campaign, you are going to be there for a while. It's just not, they rarely hit stat sig on a placement basis. So that's one of my core problems with them. I think they're really helpful for like awareness and sentiment and consideration monitoring. Like when you're doing hearts and minds campaigns and you're affecting behaviors on a different scale, that's a little different.
Got it. And what about, so we talked about, pixel-based attribution and some of the challenges there, and with scaling that to like the entire campaign, brand lift studies, like having your place. But, what other ways do you recommend marketers, especially those coming from like, well, the Facebook world, use, like, how should they think about measurement for their campaigns?
By far the best practice is still survey-based methodology. I know it's not the answer that anybody wants. It's not the answer I want. Right. When I came to from digital for the first time, I remember looking at a multiplier in a campaign and literally saying, oh, I want to multiply all my activity by 5x2. That's BS. But it actually holds over time. And a lot of the survey data, actually all of the survey data is first-party advertiser data. And so what we do, we tend to lean most heavily on first-party data when we are decisioning for media. And so there are best practices in terms of how we do that. We also do use channel-specific tech-enabled solutions. So on the TV end, we absolutely use stuff like LiveRamp and Data Plus Math and TV Squared. So it's not that you can't use supplemental methodologies, but survey-based attribution actually lets you kind of like level set across all of your channels. so that you're then not adding 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 and getting 17 when it comes to looking at the total sum of your attribution. And I want to time check us. We're at 10:32. We probably want to open it up for questions in a little bit here. If there's any other, it's so funny. We were so ambitious with everything we wanted to cover here. We knew this would happen. I'm trying to like, what are the other hot topics that we want to cover? But if anybody has questions, if you want to start popping them into chat and we can get to them in a couple of minutes here, we could probably reserve like the last 10 minutes or so for questions and additional conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think like, one of the I'll zoom out here of the Podscape, or I can even stop sharing. One of the things that I always think about is like, lowering the barrier to entry for advertisers coming into the space. What are you thinking about in that context?
I actually don't think the barriers to entry are that high. Like, I think so we generally tell advertisers that you should be indexing your test spend on what your other media channels are spending in market right now. That wasn't English, but you guys get what I mean. And then like, we also say like, whatever you normally spend on tests, this should be proportionate. So you want to make sure that this is proportionate to the rest of your media spend at the time, because if it's not, you're going to wind up throwing a false negative or positive on the test. But generally, there is no minimum that you need to test in this channel. Anyone telling you have to spend $250,000 to find out a false, like a true negative or positive, is just not right. And that's part of why we decouple media spend from comp for us. We generally tend to recommend an initial starting budget between $50,000 to $150,000.
Okay.
And that's over 7 to 10 weeks. There are outliers in either directions. We do launch $250,000 tests all the time, but that is because in proportion to the actual, like the rest of the advertiser's media mix, you need to spend $300,000 to get a blip and to feel it and to get the actual true positive or negative you need to move forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, it's interesting how like, it sounds like some barriers to entry like aren't super high, but they're also like, I think one of the challenges certainly is like in the data, especially, is like how easy and it is to like rely on heuristics like without looking at data. So we were, talking with one of our advertising partners who had kind of pulled back from podcasts right at the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020. And, this was an advertiser that was based in Los Angeles. So of course, like everyone listens to podcasts while they're commuting. And it was months later, and we were going to have this conversation around, like, okay, so, the marketing team's perception there was that, no one was commuting and therefore no one was listening to podcasts, and therefore podcast listenership must be way down and it's not a good channel. Which it's, that's why we need data.
Do you mean that my personal experience consuming a media channel shouldn't be the only thing that I'm using directionally to plan? No. Like I had the same, Cam and I were laughing before this. I had the same thing happen at the same time. It was somebody who's like, I'm not listening to NPR in the morning right now, so nobody else must be. And I'm like, bro, like you are not indicative of the average media consumer. This is the kind of like bias and subjectivity I just want to remove from the process. That is so perfect. It's also when like, I actually ask all the time, like, what are your favorite podcasts? What are podcasts that like people at your company listen to? It's super helpful and it's interesting, but like, we can't just give all of our favorite podcasts money, or I would only buy Armchair Expert. So like, I'm an armchair. I'm so sorry. We're going to continue having these conversations this way. I'm peeking through the chat. You guys are hilarious. Kareem, that you can have my laugh as a ringtone, but you're going to annoy the crap out of everybody around you. That is really funny. Brian said, this is the energy I need right now. Thank you. I appreciate that. What is the best way to measure then, especially when a client's utilizing podcasts and an extension of a digital and linear campaign? So it really is the survey-based methodology that I mentioned. And I think we have, I'll reshare our screen because we can give you guys like our information. If you want, you could follow up with me. I'm happy to share some information. Like I've got a big best practice doc on survey-based methodology that you can use. So yeah, I'm happy to share that. And we've also published a lot of resources for growth marketers trying to understand the channel. Most of the time when we are helping advertisers expand to podcasts, it is because they're super reliant on Facebook and paid search, which are like, that is absolutely the right way to scale your business at the outset. But in terms of like a first offline channel to engage in, I recommend podcast often, because there's very little creative production barrier. So, and also, like I said, it's like, good luck trying to spend $50,000 on a TV test. You know, you could still get a
Totally.
real true or false.
Yeah, we see a ton of advertisers coming into podcasts right after, like, they've, you know, gotten to the point where they're like, I don't want to be completely reliant on Facebook and Instagram the rest of my, you know, company's existence. And so, you know, podcast is a great place to go to test some of that, or, you know, test alternate channels instead of like TV. I mean, TV makes sense. And that's why, you know, you hear an advertiser in podcasts, and then, you know, 12 months later, you see them doing an ad campaign on TV. It's pretty amazing.
Exactly. And like, we tend to parallel path those channels all the time. It's really interesting, like TV and podcasts, radio, all of these channels work in concert. And this is where we start getting back to like the old school, like, you know, cross media frequency and all of the things that we can't understand, unfortunately, about the channel just yet.
Yeah, I see like a couple questions that have popped up that I want to throw out there.
I'm looking at, why is chat being so mean to me right now, you guys?
I see one that says, do you find you can use DAI successfully for performance marketing, or do you only leverage it for awareness?
I don't. When we think about DAI, episode specific DAI will work, but you have to flight it differently than you flight baked in ads. If we're talking about like broad-based programmatic media and run of site and run of show and all of that stuff, no, it does not back out consistently for advertisers. And what I'm going to tell you guys that nobody who sells inventory on this screen share is going to like, programmatic technology was developed to monetize a glut of inventory on the interwebs. We do not have a glut of inventory in podcasting. It's a finite inventory supply. Also, the solutions that are available are not programmatic. The closest that we have right now is a demand side platform that lets you buy across exchanges in theory, or an exchange basically that they run, but there's no transparency. As an advertiser, I can't find out where my ads ran. I have horror stories from the early days of digital where I can confirm that, yes, my ads did run in adult content. So like, can we not make the same mistakes of the past? And also, can we give the advertisers the control? Because the moment anybody wants to give me a login to their DSP, I will bid on and buy dynamically inserted inventory. You're not going to like the CPMs, because we're probably going to be bidding like $5, $6, $7, because at that point, it's streaming audio inventory. There's no host listener connection, and I'm just buying earballs basically. So that is my like step off of my soapbox, but it's driving me nuts. And I've launched 2 trading desks. I have transacted programmatically for the better part of the last 10 years. I want programmatic inventory available in the channel. I don't want it to devalue premium inventory. I don't want it to piss listeners off. And I don't want us to use it as the one size fits all tool, especially not until we know where the heck our ads are going and what we're actually paying, because the CPMs right now are between $20 and $40 for behaviorally targeted inventory. There's no way we're spending that. And there's no way it's backing out. Like, anyway, I really could go off on this.
To be fair, it sounds like there's a place for programmatic, but you know, there's also a place for, you know, host-read ads that, you know, the people know and love, and that what makes podcasts really special.
Yeah, and actually, Brooke, I think just mentioned, I've used post-purchase pop-ups to measure channels' effectiveness, especially podcasts. I am the biggest fan of a post-purchase survey. Put it past your most difficult funnel activity, and that is where you will get the real media insights that you need to prioritize your media spend, not just like podcast, but all channel effectiveness, to your point. Sasha, in regards to top shows on Apple, do you consider it a win if you purchase a new show at 100,000 and it goes to 150 an episode? Absolutely. But that is exactly the kind of like room that we have right now in CPMs, because the second that doesn't become possible for advertisers, y'all are getting $15 CPMs on the regular. And so like, this is the chicken and egg. It's like, we're projecting downloads and we're doing it conservatively. The advertiser, because they're buying on a fixed cost spot basis, might actually get some additional impressions. But on the flip side, the publisher doesn't have to go back and reconcile and re-deliver if they didn't deliver in show. So it's definitely it's challenging. Because I understand, like, then on the publisher end, there's like this want and desire to make sure you're, from an inventory yield perspective, that you're making the most that you can, but you may be making the most that you can from leaving a small amount of inventory unsold and getting premium CPMs from advertisers like us. Like, it's just, you have to look at it on like a revenue per user basis. And there's actually some really good stuff published in yield management on the digital industry side that should help partners like figure that out. How do you think categories like food delivery apps and the ED products that have reached a saturation point and are no longer novel products and services should measure results and lift? At this point, it feels like they should find appropriate channels and buy for share of voice. Yes and no. We run DoorDash, so in full disclosure, I'm very familiar with these challenges, and we have worked in the ED space for quite some time. The long and short answer is, yeah, you can still get show level performance and like granular performance. There is definitely, in certain categories like this, like mattresses and bedding, we tend to take the approach competitively of burning it all down. So like, Godspeed, but if you're trying to get into meal delivery in 2021, DoorDash is there already. Good luck. Sorry. I mean, sorry, not sorry. Like, they are, it's so funny because I give a lot of money back to DoorDash in the form of being an avid consumer of the products, but the greatness of that product and the way that we buy it means that we're able to basically, like you're saying, like, stake out our positioning in the channel and figure out what works for us. But I definitely think like there's going to always be some cross advertiser attribution. I have always wanted to know what that would be. I just have no idea how we'd ever measure it. Are there certain types of brand products? I'm going to go quick here, and we can stay on for a couple of minutes, guys, if everybody wants to. So are there certain types of brand and product that are more or less well suited to podcasts? Yes. If your key demographic is 55 plus, don't go here, go to radio. Maybe Sirius, but probably radio. If you are a broad product with product market fit, and when I say broad, that means that you like reach an audience that's not just like the most niche of the niche of the niche. You can still find success in podcast advertising, but it's not going to be like a scaled platform for you like Facebook is. When we think about like other types of brands and products, something with a novel modality. So if it's like brand new and you need to like build credibility for it, you don't have household brand awareness, love podcasts for that. That endorser connection is so critical for brands. I think genuinely, I have found that most brands with product market fit and, you have to have optimized landing pages. To Dana's point, please use a vanity URL or promo code for tracking. I prefer vanity URL because then you can control the user experience. And we actually do find a meaningful lift somewhere around 10%. When you even just mention like, welcome Joe Rogan listener. It's just good to acknowledge them, but also you control the experience. And that's really, as an advertiser, what I want. Are you anti-programmatic because it can't guarantee a good listener experience? Oh, that's part of it. I was listening to an episode of Oprah's Super Soul, and like a Weight Watchers ad came in when I was in the middle of like choking up about Lady Gaga, and it was so loud, and I will literally never forget it. I was driving my car, and scared the crap out of me. Like, it was the most terrible user experience. But apart from that, it's because there's no transparency and it's not real programmatic yet. Programmatic is a bid-based marketplace. Everything right now is closed platform and a managed like demand side platform. So until we get to the point, hey, if any on the DSPs out there want to give me a login so I can bid with advertiser dollars, I'm happy to do it. But until I can see where my ads are going, I will be anti-programmatic, because I have dealt with make goods in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for programmatic, and that is not energy that I want to bring to podcasting. Dana, $20 to $40 CPM depended on the content and amount of downloads. No. Yes, but even if the amount of downloads meets expectations, I'm saying that inventory is not worth the $20 to $40 CPM because of that breakage with the host listener connection. What's the minimum level of return on ad spend you'd consider a success for a brand's initial test and podcast? So like any channel, we can't guarantee ROI with a first test. That's just, there's going to be risks associated with testing any new channel, including Facebook. But in terms of like return on ad spend, we find that a lot of, unfortunately, the industry average for renewing from a first test is somewhere between 20 to 30%. Our renewal rates at Right Side Up are actually significantly higher, somewhere in the 40 to 50% range. But I would say that you can probably expect a minimum of 0.5 ROAS on like your first initial test that ages out without any optimization to media spend. I have seen initial tests pay back at 2 or 3 to 1, but I want to caution that like it's going to be somewhere in the middle. And same thing, Jonathan, great question. What's the minimum, or at what level of spend do you see a loss in efficacy and performance? It depends on the brand. I would say that like, if you look at an advertiser like Zip, they've been in the channel for approximately 80 years and a day. And they are not they're probably seeing some attrition on performance. Like it's not 2015 anymore, but they're still investing, and in an aggregate, they are still seeing success on the channel. So it really is very advertiser contingent. Yeah, Brooke, literally unbounce. I've absolutely done the same thing. When I ran Right Side Up's podcast campaign, like last fall, we did like the smallest test spend. Like don't tell anybody, but I didn't follow my own best practices. We just did 2 episodes instead of 3 because I can project out. I knew it wouldn't pay back, long story short. But the same way that you're saying about building out pages on Unbounce, I exactly did the same thing. I built out pages on Unbounce so I could track everything. And to your point about them being tailored to each show, we were then able to see like what actually made it over to GA, et cetera. How do you determine
one more question?
I think let's, I'm good to like, we could do more questions.
Sure.
If you want to, I can't, for some reason, Cam, I can't get the questions to like pop.
Yeah, I can kind of see them as I come in, getting some spicy ones. How do you determine if a show is going to be a total flop versus having some long-term scalability? Are there like past campaign indicators you look at, I think is the question.
You know, it's funny. We actually, I have a really good link that I can share. It's a blog post that we did last year called Minding the Gap. It's on Right Side Up's website, but sorry, I did not mean to do that. I am incapable of using the internet. We have because basically we can tell like there are markers that if a show after the first integration, second, third, et cetera, if we tend to see that they're performing at a certain threshold, we actually can know whether or not they'll pay back for the first test, even before the campaign ends. Some of the markers that we look at are like, well, first of all, when we think about post-campaign, make sure you're enough post-campaign. Like you should be looking at performance somewhere between 3 to 6 weeks out from your last spot. I've seen shows pay back 2 months later after we launched our last integration. We decided not to renew because it wasn't backing out. 2 months later, we'll go to renew a show and it won't be available because it's then backing out. So you have to make sure that when you're looking, your performance window is set appropriately. And frankly, that's another challenge with pixel-based attribution because there are no standard windows for attribution the way that there are in digital. So yeah. And how would you fight DAI to mimic baked in? It's different with every show. I wish there was like a specific way that I could tell you by X impressions every X minutes and blah, blah. Like I can't yet. It really is very show by show, like individually negotiated basis, because it also depends on CPM. And that's another thing, like CPM was never something I used to talk about with advertisers extensively. And now it's coming up more and more and more. Like the work that we're doing programmatically is having impact on like advertisers being like, I don't want to pay $35 CPM on blah, blah, blah. Like it's going to have downstream effects. So yeah, Sarah, I wish I had an answer for you. I'd be so happy if I had an answer for my advertisers, but we don't. NPR podcasts are great. Like it's, like I mentioned the challenge being like, I don't want to call out any one publisher, but like the more public radio, broader, like kind of hearts and minds stuff. It's just because we are using podcasts as a direct response tool for most of our advertisers. They just don't back out quite the same as like, the show that winds up doing a 6-minute ad read because they have no considerations. And I think somebody mentioned that like NPR isn't beholden digitally, like FCC standards don't basically apply to digital. NPR, WNYC, all of these organizations are still going to have like the journalistic integrity. That means that a producer will read instead of a reporter, which means that you are not going to have the same person doing the ad read that is doing the content. And that is one of the key things that we see in podcasting. Like if it's not host endorsed or at least host read, I very rarely will buy it. And if I do buy it, it's going to be in like the single digit low teen CPMs as like purely a test. I like a 70-20-10 cadence whenever we can do it for testing. So 70% of your test should be in like really solid test or core. 20% should be like more aggressive tests. And then 10% is, we all have fun words for it, fun money, F it bucket. There's like just basically your crazy things. Like when I was in-house, I spent 10% of my budget on sponsoring an audio fiction podcast in 2018. It did not work. But it was great. And it wound up having like other performance implications and other awareness implications. So
you mentioned 6-minute ad read. For the record, I think the longest we've picked up is 11 minutes.
Okay. But what's funny about that is I know for a fact that like 1 billion years ago, somebody did a half an hour ad read for like MeUndies. Like we have, and this is where like also like, it's just so funny to me that like the content's on YouTube. Like I always tell advertisers before we do something like Bill Burr, I'm like, go look at his old ad reads. And if you can listen to that and not get scared, then you can have Bill Burr. And when you look at the ad reads, they have like 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 views on them. And I'm like, why are you listening to ads? But they like it. Jonathan, yeah, exactly. Every 3 to 4 weeks on a single show. I like to say 1 episode every 3 as like kind of a default, but I would say we tend to go between 1x2, 1x3, or 1x4. 1x4 being like more of a monthly cadence. That's like, it's more useful for the bigger shows where you're accruing a lot of media spend when you have to back out on the back end. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I would say like, when in doubt, every 3 weeks. If there are other considerations, like if it's an awareness campaign and I got to do something like in Q4 and I got to get everything in market by Black Friday, I'm going to go hard and go 1x2 because I may or may not be as efficient as I normally would, but if I have seasonality and other tailwinds behind me, it should carry me through.
Well, this has been great. I think we're 10 minutes over and 79 brave souls are still with us. Pretty amazing. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you guys. And this is how to get in touch with me and Cam. You can find us on LinkedIn. We're both Krystina or Cameron at our domains, and we clearly love to nerd out about this stuff. This is basically a conversation Cam and I would have anyway. But thank you guys so much for hanging in there. And if you have like questions or you want follow-ups or additional resources or anything like that, please let us know because we are genuinely here to help. We want to see the industry grow and prosper and be as amazing as we know it can be, because at the end of the day, I have never worked in an industry where more people care more about the success about it and about working together to make it great. So thank you guys, advertisers, publishers, technology partners, everything. Really appreciate you and look forward to keeping it going and continuing our discussion.
I echo all those sentiments. All right. Have a great day, everyone.